The sirens tore through the cold February night, slicing the darkness like knives. Red and blue lights bounced off row houses, cracked sidewalks, and the lingering smoke of a winter storm. Philadelphia was a city wrestling with its own shadows in 1953: poverty, violence, and a youth culture growing more desperate by the day. And in the middle of it all, a 15-year-old boy named Joe Ligon stood frozen, breath sharp in the icy air, as the world collapsed around him. Detective Raymond Mercer pushed past uniformed officers and knelt beside a bleeding man on the sidewalk. "Two victims," an officer said. "Stab wounds. One is critical. We've got witnesses saying it was a pack of teenagers." Mercer scanned the scene: scattered bottles, footprints in the slush, and confusion etched across frightened faces. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was frenzy, chaos, something raw and uncontrolled. A block away, Joe and 4 other teens sprinted between buildings, hearts pounding. They weren't hardened criminals. They were poor kids drifting through life, drawn into a night that turned darker than anyone intended. They'd been drinking, wandering from block to block, caught in the kind of reckless energy that sets fire without warning. Joe stumbled, nearly falling. "Man, I didn't mean for this to go that far," he whispered, shaking. The others didn't respond. Panic had swallowed them whole. Minutes later, the police swarmed in. Joe barely had time to raise his hands before rough palms slammed him against a wall. He didn't fight. He couldn't. His mind kept replaying flashes of the chaos: shouting, shoving, a blade glinting in the streetlight, screams echoing through the Philadelphia night. Back at the station, Mercer watched the boy sit alone in the interrogation room. Joe was small for 15, thin, with the look of a kid who'd survived more hunger than happiness. But guilt or confusion was painted all over him. Mercer stepped inside. "Joe Ligon, right?" Joe nodded, eyes red. "I didn't kill nobody." "Then tell me what happened." Joe swallowed hard. We got into it with some guys. I was drunk, too drunk. People were shouting. Somebody got stabbed. But it wasn't supposed to happen. I swear, sir. I swear." Mercer studied him carefully. Kids lied. Hardened criminals lied. But this felt different. Joe didn't look like a killer. He looked like a scared child in over his head. But the injured victims weren't children. And one of them wouldn't survive. The district attorney came down hard. Public pressure was boiling. A city fed up with gang violence wanted answers and punishment. The DA pushed for felony murder, arguing the group attack made every boy responsible. No exceptions. No mercy. When Joe's family learned he was facing life without parole, his mother wept uncontrollably. His father, a quiet, worn man who'd worked fields in Alabama before moving north for a better life, simply lowered his head in silence. They didn't understand the system, didn't understand the courts, and they had no power to stop it. The courtroom was packed on sentencing day. Joe stood trembling, hands cuffed, the judge towering above him like a monument carved from stone. The prosecutor painted a picture of a violent teen gang. The defense argued Joe was a misguided boy, not a murderer. But in 1953, that wasn't enough. With a single gavel strike, Joe Ligon, 15, uneducated, scared, became the youngest person in Pennsylvania to receive a mandatory life sentence. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Joe blinked slowly, as if the world had shattered around him and he couldn't see the pieces anymore. Mercer, watching from the back, felt a strange twist in his gut. Justice had been done, but something about it felt wrong, like a puzzle with the edge pieces missing. That evening, as the cold wind scraped across the prison yard, Joe was walked through steel gates that slammed shut behind him with the finality of a tomb. He had no idea he wouldn't walk back out for 68 years. But the real twist, the detail that would haunt investigators, advocates, and even some of the original officers, wouldn't come until decades later. Because the truth about that night was not what everyone thought. Prison changed Joe Ligon, but not the way people expected. He didn't become hardened. He didn't grow violent, bitter, or cold. Instead, he became quiet, watchful, a kid forced to grow up inside walls meant for broken men. By 20, he'd watched others around him crack under pressure: fights, Stabbings, mental breakdowns, escapes gone wrong. But Joe kept his head down. Books became his lifeline. Work detail became routine. And time, that slow and merciless thief, kept moving. Decade after decade. Outside, the world transformed. Inside, Joe stayed frozen in the moment he entered, still a boy in the eyes of the law, but aging into a man the system would never re-examine. Or so it seemed. In 1979, long after the city had forgotten Joe's name, a clerk named Evelyn Cates transferred into the Philadelphia County Records Office. She wasn't a detective, not a lawyer, just someone who liked paperwork neat and stories complete. And while sorting old homicide files, she found one that didn't sit right. It was stamped, Ligon, Joseph 1953. Inside, the ink was fading. Pages were torn. But two things caught her attention immediately. First, multiple witness accounts were contradictory. Second, evidence logs were incomplete, some pieces marked, not recovered, others simply missing. And then there was the biggest red flag, a handwritten notepaper clipped to the back page. Victim statements unclear. Possible misidentification. Follow-up required. But there had been no follow-up. The file had been shoved into storage and forgotten. Evelyn hesitated. She wasn't an investigator. She had no authority. But something gnawed at her, the idea that a teenager could have been buried alive by a rushed prosecution. She made a quiet phone call. 2 weeks later, a young public defender named Marvin Ellis walked into her cubicle. Tall, sharp-featured, with a constant air of exhaustion, Marvin was known for two things: taking hopeless cases and refusing to let them die. "You said you found something," he muttered, sliding into the chair. She handed him the file. Marvin flipped through it quickly, his brow tightening. "This is bad," he whispered. "This is really bad. Do you think he did it?" Evelyn asked. Marvin closed the folder. "I think the city needed someone to blame, and they didn't care who." What neither of them knew was that this small decision, a nosy clerk and an overworked lawyer, would ignite a battle stretching across decades. Marvin visited the prison the next week. In the visiting room, Joe walked in slowly, shoulders slumped, hair gray at the temples, even though he was only 41. "You're the lawyer?" Joe asked. "I'm trying to be," Marvin said. "I'm looking into your case." Joe blinked. "My case? That was a lifetime ago." Marvin leaned in. "Do you still maintain you didn't stab anyone?" Joe nodded. "I told the truth back then, but nobody cared." Marvin's jaw tightened. "Maybe it's time someone did." Their conversation lit something in Joe, a spark he hadn't felt since he was 15. Hope, fragile and unfamiliar. But hope in the world of criminal justice is dangerous. Because the more Marvin dug, the stranger things became. Witnesses from 1953 had died, moved away, or forgotten details. Police reports conflicted with each other. Some mentions of weapons didn't match the autopsy. And the most unsettling discovery: one suspect from Joe's group had privately admitted to multiple stabbings, but the statement had never been submitted into evidence. Someone had quietly buried it. Someone had wanted the case closed fast. As Marvin pushed deeper, he began receiving anonymous letters, no return address, no signature. The first one read, "Let it go." The second, "You're digging where you shouldn't." The third arrived 2 months later. A single sentence: "People got killed that night, but not the way the records say." Marvin didn't show the notes to Joe. No point worrying a man who had already lost 40 years. But inside, Marvin felt a chill. If the real truth of that night was darker than the official version, they weren't just fighting for Joe's freedom. They were fighting against a secret someone had spent a lifetime protecting. Then, one evening, while reviewing an old evidence log, Marvin found an item number that didn't belong, an object seized at the scene, but never entered into court records. Item 17B, a knife. But its description didn't match any of the blades attributed to the teenagers. It was bigger, heavier, deadlier, and etched into its handle was a single initial, M. Marvin stared at it for a long, cold moment. Because he knew exactly whose name started with that letter. And if he was right, then the real killer wasn't a teenager at all. Marvin Ellis didn't sleep the night he discovered the knife entry. He sat in his office, surrounded by flickering desk lamps and towers of dusty case files, replaying every detail from the 1953 reports. One name kept resurfacing: not a suspect, not a victim, but someone whose presence felt like a shadow hanging over the investigation. Officer Martin Hale, initial M. He was one of the first officers on the scene the night of the stabbing. A man known for handling things quickly. A man who retired early, moved out of state, and never gave a public statement about the case. Marvin dug deeper. Old newspaper articles, archived personnel files, internal memos. And then he found a disciplinary record sealed from public release. Hale had once been investigated for use of excessive force involving a knife. The complaint was dismissed, but the timing matched the same year Joe was arrested. Marvin felt his stomach drop. The puzzle pieces weren't just fitting, they were crushing everything he thought he understood. He returned to the prison the next morning. Joe listened quietly as Marvin explained what he'd found. When Marvin finished, Joe leaned back, eyes heavy. "So you're telling me a cop might have done it?" "I'm saying the official story is a lie," Marvin said. "And someone buried the evidence." Joe stared at the table. "I was a kid. I didn't know what was happening. There was shouting, pushing, blades flashing. But I never stabbed nobody." Marvin nodded. "And now, we can finally prove you didn't." The next move was dangerous. Marvin filed a motion demanding the court unseal the disciplinary record and reopen the homicide file. It sparked immediate backlash. The city attorney called it an irresponsible conspiracy theory. Reporters began showing up at Marvin's office. Old police unions issued statements accusing him of attacking a decorated officer. But the judge approved the hearing. And for the first time in 60 years, the truth had a chance to breathe. In the courtroom, Marvin presented the missing file, the conflicting witness statements, the buried confession, and the unexplained knife entry. Then he revealed Officer Hale's sealed record, the pattern of incidents, the complaints, the inconsistencies. The room fell silent. Joe, now in his 80s, sat beside him, frail, hands trembling, eyes fixed straight ahead. The prosecutor tried to argue the evidence was incomplete, unreliable, too old to matter, but Marvin's voice cut through the courtroom. Too old to matter? Joe was 15 when the system destroyed his life. He has waited 68 years for the truth. That is old enough. A week later, the decision came. The court ruled that Joe's conviction had been fundamentally flawed, tainted by missing evidence, contradictory testimony, and investigative failures. There wasn't enough to accuse Officer Hale, now long deceased, but there was more than enough to prove Joe's sentence never should have happened. And just like that, the sentence was lifted. Joe Ligon walked out of prison at 83 years old, blinking in the sunlight, as if seeing the world for the first time. Cars hummed by. Children laughed in distant parks. The city that had swallowed him as a boy now stretched before him, unfamiliar and overwhelming. Reporters crowded around him. "Joe, what do you want now that you're free?" He paused, thinking carefully. "I want to walk," he said softly. "I want to see the world move. Because I haven't seen it move in a very long time." Marvin stood behind him, watching. Justice didn't feel triumphant. It felt fragile, like something that had arrived 60 years too late. But the truth, once buried, had finally clawed its way to the surface. And the system would never forget the name Joe Ligon again. If you thought this story was intense, you're not ready for what comes next. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.